That blast you just heard was one of 4 explosions at Pike River Mine. 29 men died.
I tell you, it's unbelievable. This is the West Coast darkest hour.
The ensuing review of health and safety laws has now led to the first ever prosecution of the boss of a large company for the death of a worker. Ports of Auckland CEO Tony Gibson held responsible for the crushing of stevedore Pala'amo Kolati 4 years ago.
The due diligence duty really does have teeth, and that the regulators are prepared to enforce it.
But will it open the floodgates of health and safety prosecutions?
If they cross the line, they allow the sort of behaviour to carry on and they know about it, then they're just as guilty as everyone else.
Welcome to the MBR podcast. I'm your host Simon Shepherd. Pala'amo Kolati was a Ports of Auckland stevedore. When he was on a night shift during COVID in 2020, he was crushed by a container. Both Maritime NZ and Auckland Council investigated. Here's former Mayor Phil Goff.
What we've seen in recent years is 3 fatalities and a number of other serious injuries. And what I really want to have is some certainty around whether we have in place on the wharves the health and safety regime that we need.
That terrible safety record played a part in Maritime NZ's investigation, which led to the port's boss Tony Gibson being charged under the Health and Safety at Work law. And now, in the first decision of its kind, he's been found guilty.
We're very pleased. We actually didn't think the justice system would prevail here, so we really acknowledge the judge's commitment.
Carl Fidlay is the National Secretary for the Maritime Union of New Zealand. It represents the port workers. You were surprised by the finding?
Yeah. We didn't think in this current environment that we'd have a judge with the courage to convict and to find guilty, and we have. So,
what do you mean by the current environment?
Well, the political environment,
right,
obviously, is very business orientated at the moment. There would have been a hell of a lot of pressure, in my opinion, in our opinion, that there'd be undue influence in there somewhere along the line.
You don't actually know that?
No.
That's your opinion?
That's just our thoughts.
Okay, so you are grateful for the decision that has been handed down by Justice Bonner. If we just go back, Pala'amo Kolati was killed in 2020 and it's now December 24. It's taken 4 years. How would you describe the process?
Well, far too long and far too cumbersome, and I know everything got backed up because of COVID, and like everyone else, I'm sick of hearing about that. But that's the truth of the matter. But even although then it was still way too long to get some justice for the family and friends that bore the brunt of all this.
So what was the CEO, Tony Gibson, actually found guilty of? Here's Liz Coates. She's a partner at Gully and specialises in employment law.
So Mr Gibson was charged and found guilty of failing to exercise due diligence in his role as an officer. And what that required was for him to exercise a reasonable skill, diligence and care that another officer would exercise in the same circumstances to ensure that the port was ensuring the health and safety of its workers. Right.
So it wasn't the fact that he didn't have to actually hands-on ensure the safety of the workers.
No.
It's a much higher level than that.
Exactly. His role was ensuring that the port was complying with its duties, because the port had the primary duty of care to ensure the safety of its workers while they were at work.
So, I mean, this stevedore was killed in 2020, but what were the facts around his death that actually led to this charge being found guilty by the Judge Bonner?
There's really 2 layers to the facts that are important here. One is some of the history in relation to the port itself. So the port had a history of several safety incidents which had involved quite tragic outcomes, injuries, etc. And those were very much on the regulator's radar at the time it came to consider the circumstances of Mr Kolati's death, the worker in this case. And in relation to the circumstances here, Mr. Kolati was found to have been directed to stand inside an exclusion zone, which materially increased the risk to his life and unfortunately in this case did result in his death.
The conundrum here, or the tension here, is that as CEO, Tony Gibson was not involved on a day-to-day basis in terms of ensuring health and safety, but he's ultimately held responsible for that at a personal level. What did the judgment say about that?
It had quite a lot to say about that. I mean, most of the judgment is devoted to analysing the extent to which he did have a role in ensuring that the work that was being done was consistent with what the work should be being done,
right?
How it should be being done. So in his role as CEO, the judge actually found he did have quite a significant role to play in health and safety on the ground. A material amount of his bonus and his KPIs were actually directed at health and safety outcomes.
Right.
His job description also required him to be taking responsibility for health and safety decision making within the port. Now, he did have a whole team of people beneath him who were more intimately involved on a 100% basis in health and safety decisions. But what the judge found was that despite the fact that he's a CEO with all the best intentions in the world and someone who was very dedicated to the team of people who worked at the port, he was required to be quite actively involved in making sure that whoever the team was that was tasked with performing the health and safety related roles on the ground were actually doing what they should be doing.
Right.
And the fact that he was the CEO with, multiple other things on his list, so to speak, wasn't an excuse to him not being in that sort of capacity of exercising due diligence. Yeah,
the judge did acknowledge that in a way that there is a tension between those two sort of roles, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is this something, the fact that Mr. Gibson had KPIs and factors in his employment agreement related to health and safety in an industry which is like the port? Is this sort of an exclusive ruling and only a sort of unique set of facts at the moment which relates to that industry? It's not something that we can transpose to other industries and other companies?
The facts are very specific to Mr. Gibson and the port, but the principles and the decision absolutely can be applied across all businesses. I think all officers, regardless of whether you work, your business is a desk-based business with people primarily sitting behind computer screens, or your business is one in which people are on the port in what is obviously a high-hazard environment, the principles around what your duties involve will be the same.
Let's just recap where this law came from. 2010, when Pike River Mine exploded, CEO Peter Whittle was front and centre.
It was actually me that delivered the news today, and so I funded the families by myself and gave them the news. It was hard, obviously. They've looked to me for hope, and they've looked to me for keeping them informed and to let them know what's going on.
But when it came to responsibility, some of those families were extremely unhappy that Whittle escaped prosecution. 12 charges against Peter Whittle were dropped in a deal with WorkSafe in return for a voluntary payment of $3.4 million, an agreement later deemed unlawful by the Supreme Court. And that led to the 2015 Health and Safety at Work Act.
The law very much originated from sort of the examination that took place following the Pike River tragedy. So following that Pike River tragedy, questions were asked about whether our health and safety law was fit for purpose. There was a Royal Commission of Inquiry, many recommendations were made, one of which was about making sure that the people at the top of the organisational chart, so to speak, had a real accountability when it came to health and safety outcomes.
Right. And so fast forward to today, is it just CEOs or other people at the top of companies, even like the board of directors, who are facing the same kind of potential liability under health and safety?
It definitely goes beyond a CEO.
Yep.
So the definition of an officer includes directors of companies, it includes partners and partnerships, it includes people who've got significant influence in relation to the decision-making in a business or undertaking. The specific example that's given for that kind of broader definition is a CEO, which is why it wasn't in contention here that Mr. Gibson was an officer. But potentially it's not just a CEO, it could be another senior executive. We haven't seen that tested yet, though.
And that is why phones are running hot, not only in big law firms, but also at the Institute of Directors.
I think anything that creates more uncertainty for directors, what it means, is always going to attract some level of reaction.
Guy Gibson is with the Institute and looks after issues of governance.
There have already been concerns about liability created through things like the climate-related disclosures and other matters, and you've seen that in the financial sector too. This adds to that.
Yep.
And you can imagine a range of company directors looking at this and their boards and saying, okay, what does this mean for us? And convening pretty quickly to work that through with their legal advisors.
Initially, do you have any understanding of the implications?
It's quite tricky, because the law talks about officers and it doesn't differentiate between officers who are managers. In the case of Tony Gibson, he was the chief executive, and officers as board members. And it's one of the things we put in our submission to the Health and Safety Regulatory System Review that said we thought that needed to be clearer because they have different roles, and we want to reinforce the role of governance as well as the role of managers and making sure those things are clear.
What do you think it could mean for someone who is considering becoming a company director when they're looking at the liabilities that come with the job? Will this put people off putting their hand up for those kinds of roles?
So we've asked that question in a director sentiment survey for the last several years. Certainly the number of people who are worried about compliance costs and liabilities as directors has reduced, but it's still more than 50% of our members responding to that survey who are saying they're worried about that. Secondly, we asked a question this year in the 2024 Director Sentiment Survey about what they were most preoccupied with the Companies Act reforms, and liability was the number one issue for directors in the response to that.
One of the comments in the judgment by Judge Bonner, they said that a practical tension exists between holding leaders accountable at the top of the organisation and the fact that those leaders are removed from the day-to-day health and safety processes and running of the organisation. Can you see, or would you agree that there is this sort of practical disconnect?
There's certainly a question of how processes work to ensure that, in this case, board members and managers are well informed about what's happening at the front line. Our expectation in terms of the third pillar of our four pillars, which is called holding to account, means setting up processes by which performance expectations are clear, but also having systems and processes to monitor that performance of executives, but also what's happening at the front line.
So the Maritime Union told me that they believe that this is a fair decision because they're continuously told that the buck stops at the top. Is that the same as the director's viewpoint when you're saying hold to account?
I think we'd take a view that says directors and executives, but directors in our case, are part of a system and they play a valuable role, and if they govern well, then that should result in better health and safety outcomes and better outcomes for businesses more broadly. This is a case of everybody playing their role, not just one player or another. And bear in mind the Health and Safety Work Act has obligations not just on directors or officers, but also on employees as well. Yes,
okay, but we are looking specifically at, as the judgment said, people at the apex of these organisations and large organisations. As you mentioned before, I mean, Tony Gibson was the CEO of Ports of Auckland, an officer of the company, not a director. And you're saying that in the eyes of this law, there's no difference between directors and managers, essentially. Is that right?
So the law says and puts obligations, the due diligence obligations on officers. And it doesn't distinguish between executive managers and board members.
Right. Why should it distinguish between them?
Because those roles are different. We expect managers to have more of a hands-on, week-to-week, year-to-year type role. We expect directors to have a much more longer-term view, looking at these things over the course of years, looking over the horizon, doing the things that managers day-to-day can't be involved in.
At the moment, the law also says that responsibility is down on an individual basis, doesn't it?
So, yes, it does.
So does that mean as a director, it's not the whole board that's responsible for what happens at a company, but it can be sheeted home to an individual director?
That's what the law says.
Yeah.
In our submission on the Health and Safety Regulatory System Review, we said that was probably appropriate, but it also potentially needed to have a wider scope with collective responsibility for boards. Again, that relies on differentiating the offices between boards and management, but that notion of collective responsibility would be another thing to look at.
So, collective responsibility means that, if something goes wrong, how do you penalise the company? How do you penalise the board?
Well,
if it's not on an individual basis.
And that's certainly something to be worked through. The problem with the individual basis at the moment is boards work on a collective basis.
Yeah.
They're meant to work on a basis that they are collectively responsible for the operation of a company, which is pretty similar to what happens, say, with the cabinet. They have a sense of collective responsibility. The way the law is currently framed with that individual accountability means that that collective spirit, that collective operation is actually endangered through that.
Is it fair that somebody who is in governance of a company or even running a company from a management point of view, is it fair to say that they are personally responsible when they're not involved on a day-to-day basis? It seems to be the crux of this argument here.
Yeah, it's the question what they're personally responsible for. The due diligence or the duties are a due diligence obligation. That means about asking the right questions, understanding the answers. And we've argued in terms of a guide we've produced recently on health and safety governance, that's a case of just adopting good governance practice.
Right.
Doing all of the things we'd expect directors to do, as I've outlined, in particular in terms of that accountability stuff, but also setting strategy, making sure there's the right culture in those organisations, and following the spirit of the law. That's the essence of our 4 pillars.
Right. Is there any expectation at the moment on directors that they would be actually involved, hands-on, or understanding the processes?
No, because that would be inconsistent with the role that we think directors practicing good governance would be involved in.
But at the moment, does the law not acknowledge that? And so there is the possibility that directors of a company could be held responsible on a personal basis for not getting involved.
Well, there's no doubt that they're personally liable right now, and that's certainly exercising a range of directors' views. There's also no doubt that some of the good practice includes site visits, acquainting yourself with what's actually happening on the ground as well. I don't think that's going as far as you're describing in terms of being involved in the day-to-day work.
In your submission on these laws, you have said there should be less focus on penalties. Why is that?
Well, there's a real risk with this judgment as well as others that what it does is actually force directors, because of that concern about liability, and bear in mind it could be up to $600,000 personally and uninsurable, that actually drives directors...
Uninsurable, so there's no workplace insurance to cover an outcome where you have that massive amount of fine.
Or directors and officers insurance either.
Yeah, all right.
So what this potentially does is actually drive you more towards the compliance end of the spectrum, taking legal advice, having to follow that legal advice, of course, and actually not concentrating on the things that will actually deal with the really poor workplace health and safety record we have in New Zealand compared to Australia and the UK.
So the union involved wants to go further. They call this the first step towards perhaps creating a charge of corporate manslaughter, where they say, kill a worker, go to jail. Does the Institute of Directors have a view on a possible kind of charge like that and whether it could have ramifications for directors?
Only in a general way.
Yep.
Because what that does is just reinforce the penalties that are already there. And the issue with all of that is actually how do you get the right incentives for directors and officers and other parts of the health and safety system, including the government and workers, to operate in a way that will actually help us address the poor health and safety record we have. More penalties may not be the answer.
In the case of Tony Gibson, everyone, Maritime NZ, WorkSafe, law firms and port workers, are waiting to see if he is going to appeal. Ultimately, if he doesn't or loses an appeal, Gibson is facing a fine of up to $300,000. The Maritime Union says that level of penalty is not enough. As you heard, it wants a corporate manslaughter charge. Is it appropriate to carry on with that kind of campaign now that we've seen a prosecution under these health and safety laws?
I believe so.
Why is that?
Mr. Gibson, at this stage, has been found guilty. and he could possibly face a $300 fine, but the worker again, $300,000. But the worker again has paid the ultimate price.
Yep.
And his family and his kids and everyone else have got the life sentence that goes along with it. So, some of the practices, I'm not sure if I can say this, but, could border on criminal. So we need to go down that road and we need to investigate it.
Right, so you want the government to look into the idea of having a corporate manslaughter charge legislated for.
Yes.
And that would have the same kind of penalties and sentencing regime that you do in other manslaughter charges?
Yes, why not? Well, I can't see, they're just as guilty. If they cross the line, they allow the sort of behaviour to carry on and they know about it, then they're just as guilty as everyone else.
As for Tony Gibson, the NBR approached him via his lawyer for an interview, but he declined. And that wraps up this episode of the NBR podcast. Links to audio used are in the description. And thanks to content producers Jack Latham and Joseph Hisayasu. And for early access to new episodes, subscribe at nbr.co.nz. Up next, banking is boring, sure, but is it finally going to be disrupted? I'm Simon Shepherd. We'll catch you then.